Hello and welcome back to Artforms, Chapter 8. We are going to talk about printmaking today. When it comes to printmaking, the first thing that you're going to wonder is, what are they using to make this piece? And now you are probably noticing some of the characteristics of this artwork here. It looks like a combination of perhaps some painting, a little bit of photography, a little bit of mixed media. And when it comes to printmaking, I feel that it is one of the unsung heroes of the art world. There's a lot of really strong works that come from printmaking. This piece is called Quiver by Tanya Softitch. And it is a layering of images. Something about printmaking, each layer has its own color. So if we look at the image, anything that you see is red is basically made as its own layer. The section that you see in the negative space that looks a little bit like a shadow, that grayish blue, that grayish blue-green is a layer of its own. When it comes to this work, Quiver, it is this meditation on fragile structures. So we are looking at a dragonfly, and we are thinking about the wings and how they flap up and down very fast in a vibrating pace. If you think about a carousel or a Ferris wheel, they are revolving, and as they revolve, they usually make subtle shakes, and a satellite is sending data out into the space. In a way, it's just pulsating with data. So it's some really interesting concepts going on with this work of art here. Something about prints, they are one of a series of nearly identical pieces, usually printed on paper. Prints are made from a matrix. A matrix is created from metal, wood, or stone. You'll hear this word used a lot when it comes to describing a print is edition or addition. An edition is a group of images from the same matrix. So whenever a print is made, if it is made from one matrix, we call that an edition. Editions are often numbered. They indicate the sequence of pulled prints. So when they are making these prints, the first one that's finished, they'll say, this is the first edition. The second one comes out, this is the second edition, and so on. When it comes to prints, there are progressive proofs. In other words, they print one, and then if they think there needs to be some adjustments made, they print another one, and they just basically keep printing more out with adjustments until they find something that they want to stick with, and that's called a artist's proof or an AP. It is a proof at a satisfactory stage. When it comes to these print editions, they can be defined as works of art with siblings, but all original. A really interesting way to think about prints. It's a very different direction when it comes to making art. It is not like a painting where an artist can spend virtually hours on it and it's basically one work, and that work can, in a way, satisfy the artist for a long time. A printmaker is very different in that they actually print many of one image, but they like to make many of the same. So it's basically like having siblings, like having brothers or sisters. And so printmakers are basically mimicking what we are as humans. They are all the same, yet every individual is different. When it comes to the behavior of print, it is almost impossible to make the same exact thing over and over again, especially in its early stages. Per some of the purposes behind printmaking, it was developed in China in the 9th century, and it started with picture printing. By the 11th century, there was movable type. In other words, they started to add words. It developed in Europe in the 15th century due to the demand of inexpensive religious icons and playing cards. They were also using creating illustrating books with movable type. Try to get to know some of these characteristics of printmaking, learn that they were developed in China and then later in Europe, and why this process was even created. And here are the reasons why prints are made. For one, is that it is less expensive than paintings or sculpture, so they can be purchased by a wider group of viewers. When it comes to an image or a work of art, usually an artist will draw and paint that picture, and it would take a very long time. It would take a lot of money for someone to own a painting. And so printmaking actually made owning an image a lot easier. Something about printmaking, it's an easy way to influence social change via wide distribution in comparison to unique works of art. If you are in tune with so many things that are happening in the world, especially in the US right now, there are many protests going on. You'll see a lot of posters. And so those posters are there because they basically have a message that is being sent out, but at the same time, they can print them and they can distribute them relatively fast so that they can get a lot of people to read them. Another reason why people make prints is this fascination with the process and craft. So when it comes to printmaking, it definitely takes a different type of artist, a very different artist from a painter, because the process of printmaking is a little bit more technical in terms of the tools and the machinery they have to use. So we're going to actually break down some of the different types of printmaking, starting from the more simpler, then eventually talking about more of the contemporary. Similar to what we did with the drawing and even the painting chapter, where we started off basic and then we started to build upon that. We're gonna do that now here with the printmaking chapter. And here is an example of an early type of printmaking. This is basically a relief type of painting. So there is a block of wood, and you'll see that the block of wood has carvings into it. And then there is actually ink put on top of these grooves, on top of these marks, and then with the ink there, a paper is applied on top. And when the paper is removed, then you'll basically have a mirror image of what was on that block of wood. And that is a type of relief print. An example of a relief print is something like a fingerprint or a rubber stamp or even a wet tire. So what a relief print is basically something that is left over from an object. So a lot of these relief prints are something like a woodcut or a wood block print. Many of the woodcut prints lend itself to bold black and white contrast. When it comes to looking at prints, you can almost guess that it is made from a woodcut if it's only black and white. Something about woodcut, it does not easily lend itself to color. you'll notice that it's usually just two-tone. It's just sticking to with two colors because there isn't really the capability to blend and to mix. So a lot of these woodcuts are black and white. And here is an example of a woodcut print. One of the characteristics of woodcut is the lines. So you'll notice that the lines aren't exactly straight. There's a lot of fluctuations due to the carving into the wood because the wood grains are usually a particular way. So when they're, imagine carving into wood, it's really difficult to make the line straight because of the natural grains. And this work is called Prophet by Emile Nolde, 1912. Here is another example of a woodcut print, but this is at a little bit more developed stage, something about woodcut printing that comes from Japan. They actually push the medium in many ways. They're able to create very complex compositions. You can see that they use a lot of color. There's even blending involved. So despite what I said earlier about woodcut printing, in Japan, they were able to find ways to push all of these things. Something about printmaking, it's the most important or most popular medium when it comes to making art in Japan. If you were to think about the popular art medium in Europe or in Italy, a lot of it is paint, oil paint, or tempera. In Japan, their most popular art is this here, these wood prints. Something about Japanese art in general, a lot of diagonal compositions. So there's a diagonal being created with the land there, and then we have the figures running uphill. We have another diagonal being created by the silhouette trees in the negative space. Another diagonal being created from what appears to be rain marks. So many really interesting things in terms of their compositions. And this is by Utagawa Hiroshige. Shono Haku, Light Rain at Shono, number 46, 1832. So woodcut is a medium that flourished in Japan during the 17th to 19th centuries. They're able to achieve this quality, this high quality of print by using multiple blocks. So you could probably guess, in order for an artist to create a work of art like this, maybe they used like 10 blocks. Something about woodcut is that it is the preferred method of the middle class. And so we're going to talk about wood engraving now, traditionally used for book illustration. They usually use a very dense wood, something that is durable so that large additions are possible. And if you can imagine that the wood has to be pretty dense, because if they have a piece of wood that is not sturdy, if it's not strong, you can say that they can print 2 or 3 things and after that it'll be pretty worn down. So they had to get a wood that's stronger quality so they can print more for a longer duration. A lot of use of metal tools when it comes to wood engraving. And here is another example of a wood engraving or woodcut print here. And again, when it comes to woodcut, for the most part, they will be black and white. Unlike the ones that we've seen from Japan, but many other areas around the world, mostly black and white. And so we're looking at this piece here, and it's very expressive in terms of the way the figure appears. A very tall figure wielding a shovel, appearing as though he is defending himself from these bayonets or maybe these swords pointing at him. There are flames going his direction, puffs of smoke in the background, and also, if you see in the lower left-hand corner, hints of agricultural living. And this work of art is by Rockwell Kent, Workers of the World Unite, 1937. Something that you'll notice, the subject matter in terms of what Rockwell Kent is portraying is the idea of the agricultural lifestyle being in danger. Something that might sound a little bit familiar to a lot of us that live and grew up in the valley, where agriculture is a very big part of our economy and our lifestyle. This is an example of someone defending that agricultural way of life. And now we're going to talk about lino cut, or a linoleum cut. And it is very similar to the woodcut prints, except that they are using a different material. It is the gouging of synthetic linoleum surface in areas not intended to take ink. So basically like the woodcut, except they're using a softer material. It's almost like a plastic, rubbery type of material. It's linoleum, so maybe if you step on your floor, if you have floor at home, if it's not like tile, it's probably linoleum. And it's very soft, and artists, they use that to make prints. Something about lino cut is it functions as a soft matrix. There are no grains, and so it can be cut with equal ease in any direction. So with the woodcut, there's a little bit of inconveniences when it comes to cutting against the wood grain, but when it comes to linoleum, it's almost the opposite, where it's very soft and it's very easy to cut into. And here is an example of a lino cut by Elizabeth Catlett. The piece is called Sharecropper, made in 1970. So you'll notice that the artist can really produce some really interesting lines, some really dense qualities of lines in different directions. You'll notice that the artist has to be very selective with color as well. So just a few colors, but overall, when it comes to lino cut, you can say that artists have come a long way in terms of what they're able to reproduce. Back then, they were just using a piece of wood and just cutting into the wood. Now they're using a very similar process, except they're using a little bit more of an updated material. And here is an artist using a more avant-garde method of printmaking. Bestabe Romero, Ciudades que se van, Cities on the Move, 2004. The artist uses tires, and she basically puts these rolls of paper from the top of a gallery space, lets them roll down, and she allows for a tire to roll down all the way from the top, leaving a mark on the paper. So it's a little bit of a performance type of art, not just a studio type of visual art. And here is an example of what she uses to make some really interesting marks. She actually gets a tire and she manipulates it, or she gets a worn out tire and cuts into it, really making some really interesting marks using that method. Now we're going to talk about another printmaking. There's actually many different types of printmaking, and I'm hoping that you get to take notes on the differences between them. We're going to talk about intaglio. where areas below the surface hold the ink. It comes from the Italian word intagliare, which means to cut into. It's one of the other few foreign words that I'm asking you guys to remember. Intagliare, chiaroscuro, what else? Trompe-l'oeil, what else? They'll come up soon. And so when it comes to the process of intaglio, there is ink daubed on the surface, then the surface is wiped clean except for the ink that is in the grooves. There is a damp paper that passes beneath the press roller. And what makes intaglio different from the woodcut is they're adding another element to the process. They actually have a roller that actually puts pressure on the paper and the surface that it's printing from. So because they're using a print roller, you'll see these plate marks, and in a way that is proof that the process was intaglio. Seeing these plate marks. And here's an example of what it looks like, the process here. Remember to check out these videos that I'm posting on our modules. Try to keep up to date with them. Spend in between 2 and 10 minutes to watch some of these videos. Most of them are really short. A lot of these module external URLs are relatively short. So I'm hoping that they can help you guys learn a little bit more aside from what I discuss in my lectures. And so when it comes to intaglio, there's also this engraving technique where the artist uses a burin or an engraving tool on the metal plate. So the burin is the engraving tool used in intaglio. It takes strength and control. The artist then uses a scraper to smooth down rough edges of the groove. So this process takes a lot more work actually in comparison to some of the other methods. And you can see this process in the link as well in the module. So when it comes to intaglio, the lines are not drawn freely due to pressure. So there's a little bit of control involved. So when it comes to intaglio, it's something that we seen on United States currency. So we see intaglio on the dollar bills that we use. We will look at an example of intaglio by this famous artist here, Albrecht Dürer. And the work is called The Night, Death, and the Devil. So when it comes to intaglio or the engraving technique, the artist can actually make a lot of really interesting details, a lot of dark values, a lot of the different grays in between the darkest and the lightest. And there's so much depth, especially with all of the lines and the shapes that are created. A very dense image. Another type of intaglio is called dry point. It's similar to line engraving, where they're using a tool with a steel or a diamond tip. Usually, in dry point, they use a soft copper or a zinc plate. The displaced metal leaves a burr or a rough edge. And so you can see the lines that are left over using that tool. For dry point, there are just small additions and are rarely done. Mostly used to fill in details of etchings. So it's more of a in-between technique within intaglio. Another process is called etching. So etching is where there is some preparation involved using a metal plate, usually again copper or zinc, and wax or a varnish. So the artist draws through the surface to expose the metal. So imagine a metal plate and that it is made of copper or zinc. The artist etches into the surface, draws into the surface so that it can scrape away some of that metal. So what happens during etching is that once the drawing is done, the lines are cut into, some of the metal is removed, that plate is then immersed in nitric acid, and that makes grooves really based on the strength of the acid and the amount of time that the plate is in the acid bath. So when it comes to etching, remember that there is a process where they're using nitric acid. So it's almost like slightly burning into the surface. So when it comes to etching, lines are generally more relaxed and more irregular than engraved lines. So there's a little bit more expressibility where the lines can be softer if needed. And we are going to see an example of etching done by Rembrandt, and the piece is called Christ Preaching. And here is that example. And Rembrandt uses etching, engraving, and dry point here. One of the giveaways that a work of art is etching is you'll see some hints of grayness that feel a little bit blurry. So I am looking at the overall composition and noticing the really dense amount of darks and lights that are created using hatch marks. I'm hoping you guys remember that term. If we look at the character, the figure on the very left, and that he is the figure closest to us, you can see the fabric and how there are some hatching there, but also the etching quality makes it feel a little bit softer. So it's almost like it's blurry. It feels like it's a little bit smoky, and then it becomes clear again. So it becomes smoky, and then it becomes clear again. So it feels like the paper is being heated. So that's what lets me know whenever a work of art is etching. Usually if those marks are visible, I can tell. And here's another example of printmaking by Mary Cassatt. The piece is called Letter, and here she uses dry point and aqua tint, and she printed in color using 3 plates. And now we're going to talk about aqua tint. A variation of etching is a technique of sprinkling acid-resistant powder over an area that need gray tone. So, think aqua is water, tint is to add a little bit of color. So aqua tint allows for the artist to change the values somehow. So they have a little bit more control over the color. And that's what Cassatt did in her painting, the one that we just saw, or her printmaking, and the one that we just saw. In today's world, there's something called electro etching, and it's actually a little bit better than the etching done in the past, because nitric acid, I failed to mention this earlier, but it's actually pretty harmful for the body. It's not good to inhale. It'll burn you if you touch it. So nowadays they use electro etching, so it's a lot safer. And so now we're going to talk about lithography. Lithography is when there is a surface or planographic printing process based on mutual antipathy of oil and water. Something about lithography, it's faster and more flexible than the other methods mentioned earlier. And when it comes to the process of lithography, the artist draws an image on a Bavarian limestone or plate without cutting. So they actually use a particular material, this Bavarian limestone. They use these litho crayons or pencils or a touche liquid. So they actually have their own types of mark makers in this process of lithography. The whole image is treated with gum arabic. Maybe you remember the gum arabic as the binder in painting pigments such as watercolor or gouache. So during the process, the surface is dampened with water and then inked. Since the surface remains intact, lithographic stones or plates can be reused. So when it comes to lithography, the process of printmaking started becoming a lot more convenient than it was in the past. So it made printing a lot more accessible, especially during the 1800s. And here is an example of a lithograph here by Honoré Daumier, Rue Tronçonnier, April 15th, 1834. And if you're looking at this piece here, it doesn't look like the artist or the printmaker was trying to make something for the sake of delight or for the sake of beauty. Instead, this was a documented image used for a newspaper to report a crime. Here's another example of lithography being used by Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec. Ambassadeurs Artistides Bruant, 1892. When it comes to lithography, you could say that artists have a lot more control when it comes to printmaking. It's one of the most stable, it's one of the most productive. They can make very many without worrying of the matrix getting run down. And now we're going to talk about stencil. A stencil is a sheet with a design cut out of it. So imagine basically getting maybe a cardboard, and then if you're to cut out a circle, you can actually put that cardboard on any surface, and then you can draw inside the cutout, and then remove the stencil, and you can do the same thing over again. Make that same mark, lift up the sheet, put it down, make a mark, and you can keep reusing that. That's what stencil is. So they're transferring the design from the picture plane to the surface. It is a way to make multiple works of art. It is favored by street artists. Maybe some of you have heard of Banksy, a very controversial street artist from the UK. I believe he's from the UK. When it comes to stencil, shading is not possible because it's basically just one shape. And if you were to deviate from the shape, then it's not really it's not really worth cutting out a stencil if they're just going to try to control all the lines. So stencil, again, is somewhat limited, but it's very useful in making works very fast. And here is an example of an artist using stencil. You might recognize the Buddha statue here. If you are to look at some of the abstract designs, all of these are done using stencil and what appears to be spray paint, especially with the more abstract mandala type of designs. We have these crystallographic designs here. Even the quality of the paint, the drips, appear as though they were made using a spray can. This is by Kim McCarthy, and the piece is called Urban Buddha. So you'll see her using patterns created by the use of a stencil. And now we're going to talk about screen printing, also known as silk screen, or serigraphy. If you're wearing a t-shirt that has some sort of print on it, maybe a logo, or maybe your school or sport of some kind, it's probably a screen print. And the reason why it was initially called silk screen was that in the past they would use silk as the material, but nowadays they use any kind of material. And so when it comes to screen printing, they are actually using a stencil on top of a, a matrix. So it's almost like combining many different of the techniques in the past. And that is what's happening in the printmaking world, is they're basically building on the previous techniques. And so screen printing is relatively contemporary, and it's still used a lot in today's world. So for screen printing, they also have to use a rubber edge tool or a squeegee that pushes ink through the fabric in open areas of the stencil. So if you can imagine having a stencil, placing it on top of the material in which the color is to be transferred, after the color is applied, then they had to use a squeegee and to remove some of the unwanted color. So maybe if you wash your car, you probably use a squeegee to clean the window. It's basically that. Something about screen printing, it's good for producing uniform color. So here is what it appears like when it comes to the process of screen printing. So you have a frame just to keep the image stable, but then you're also applying a type of stencil on top, and then the ink is applied and a squeegee is used to remove the unwanted ink. So more info of that in the module link, check that out. So when it comes to screen printing, there's no reversal of the image as in the other printmaking processes, making it a little bit easier so they don't have to draw everything backwards. Or if you can remember the relief prints, they had to draw them backwards so that they can appear normally once the image is transferred, but no longer for screen printing. A lot of screen printing used for poster production, and we'll see an example of that here with Esther Hernandez's Sun Mad. It is actually a memorable protest against the use of pesticides. And here is Sun Mad, raisins unnaturally grown with insecticides, miticides, herbicides, and fungicides. 1982. Something about Esther Hernandez, she's actually from Danuba, in that she lived around the area during the 80s when there was a plant that had contaminated some of the water there, and that people were getting sick, and that she wanted to spread the word that it was in a way being done by this company here. Of course, this was, during the 80s, so it's no longer like that now, hopefully. But Esther Hernandez used her printmaking skills to get the word across. And that's what many printmakers do, actually. They like to use it as a type of platform to voice concerns of the people. One of the more recent ways to do printmaking is through a photo screen or a screen printing. So in this method, they are using a light-sensitive gelatin to screen fabric. So now they're using more technology. And here we have Elizabeth Murray. The piece is called Exile. And so this is a combination of color lithography and screen print with pastel application. So it looks exactly like a work of art that can be easily mistaken as an oil painting or an acrylic painting. And when it comes to when it came to printmaking in the past, it was almost limited in terms of what they can make and with the lines and the shades of color. But nowadays, especially because of the photo screen, they can do many things. It's basically just as good as making lines with any other medium. So when it comes to these more contemporary approaches of screen printing, there are machines that can actually make three-dimensional works of art, three-dimensional prints. So they're no longer just making works on a poster or a flat surface. Now they can actually reprint or remake three-dimensional works. Maybe some of you have seen that. They're actually called 3D printers. I think I have a classmate that is all into that right now. He's he's basically downloading files and making his own little sculptures at home. And so we're going to see an example of a 3D work by Ellen Gallagher. The piece is called Deluxe. Advertisements from magazines directed at black audience altered by plasticine shapes. And here is Mr. Terrific from Deluxe. So we are looking at a work of art that is relatively two-dimensional until you notice that the objects on the piece are actually made, they're actually three-dimensional objects that were created using a type of 3D printmaking. So some really interesting things happening with this piece. And so now there are digital matrices. So the matrix is no longer just wood or or stone or metal. Now they are done digitally. So they're done using a keyboard and mouse. They are infinitely reproducible. We're going to see a work of art here by Gilbert and George and also Nicola Lopez. And here is that work of art that is made using a 3D printer. A very abstract work of art. And so this has lithography, also woodblock, except that it was printed out using a type of plastic material called mylar. There are also these edition works, and we are going to see one by Martin and Munoz, Travelers Series, borrows snow globe format, a parody of those souvenir shop globes. Okay, so 3D printers can make many things, and it's almost as though they can basically make sculptures now using a printmaker or a digital matrix. And I believe that is it for the printmaking chapter. Make sure you get to know the differences between these different techniques. I know there's a lot, but you know, usually the terminologies have a hint in them. Like photo screen, okay, photo is sun, right? Aquatint, okay, that deals with water and so on. So just get to know them.